This is King Rex coming at you with a new video. This is a rebuttal video to a video called 10 Dumbest Things People Say About U.S. History. To sound smart, from slavery to the Constitution. Just doing a rebuttal of some of the things he said. Some things he gets right. Some things he gets really wrong. So I decided to go through the whole video and kind of go along with what he gets right and what he gets wrong, and anything that I kind of have an issue with.
It's human nature for people to want to tell stories in a way that fits with their biases, but too often that devolves into a downright distortion of facts. Too many Americans now say blatantly untrue things about United States history for that purpose. Some organizations have dedicated their entire existence to that mission. The result is people thinking they are challenging historical norms with false statements, and that misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Notice all the buzzwords you start here. People have their biases, a distortion of facts, blatantly untrue, false statements, misinformation. What he's basically doing is doing everything he can to pile on to anyone who disagrees with him. Like, he's saying, you guys are biased. I'm not biased. That's what he's saying. He's saying he's not biased, which is just untrue. Everyone has their own biases. If you act like you're not biased, you probably are being biased. And he's basically going hardcore, trying to rebuttal before the fact anyone that could say anything against what's in this video. He's basically trying to get out ahead of everything, which it kind of makes me wonder why the first thing you do in your video is to get out ahead of any anything that someone could say against your video. He also, I think, is showing his biases here because picking on one organization in particular. PragerU talks about false statements and misinformation, but I've not really seen anything PragerU says that's actually false. Now, they do present facts in a manner that, helps their position, which is what everyone does in the debate. But I've never seen them say stuff that's just outright false. So this kind of gives me a lens into how he looks at things. If he thinks they're just blatantly wrong all the time, his biases are probably on the other side of the political spectrum. But he's really pushing hard to make it be like, if you don't agree with me, you're biased and therefore you're wrong, which is actually false. You can be biased and be correct. You can be unbiased and not have a clue what you're talking about. And remember, everyone has biases, so it could be an issue that you just don't have any biases on because you don't know nothing about it. That doesn't mean you're correct. It just means you're not biased because you don't really know anything about that.
And the worst part is, to the untrained ear, they may sound like some genius, well-informed contrarian, even though a surface-level analysis of history will prove what they're saying is false. But what are the worst examples of that? Welcome into the History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to break down the 10 dumbest things people say about US history when trying to sound smart. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell and turn on your notifications. Leave a comment too. Tell me what you think. History Buffs Hub wants to cover anything from politics to sports to pop culture, but we can't do it without your help. For this list, we're looking at things people say about US history as if they are settled facts that fit their own narrative that turn out to not be true.
Now remember, it says settles facts to fit their own narrative that aren't true. Keep that in mind when you hear the stuff he says in some of these.
We're not looking at conspiracy theories like faking the moon landing. Those deserve their own video. These are common statements you might hear in casual conversation by somebody trying to pretend they're well-read on the topic, even though what they say is grossly inaccurate.
Pretend that they're well read, even though it's grossly inaccurate. Once again, he's really attacking anybody that doesn't agree with him, like hardcore, before he even makes an argument. He's basically attacking any rebuttal that could come forward.
Now let's dive in. Number 10, America is a Christian nation.
When people say America is a Christian nation, what they mean is America was founded on Judeo-Christian values, and sometimes we'll even add in the fact that the vast majority of people in the United States are Christians. In fact, in recent polling from like 2025, it was last year, they asked people what religion they were. The people that actually answered their religion, 9 out of 10 said Christian, where the other 10th person said a non-Christian religion. So America is a pretty Christian nation. It's be like someone saying that, Afghanistan's not a Muslim nation or Israel's not a Jewish nation, which they are. I mean, and the fact is they're not saying that America is a nation that's ruled by religious leaders like, say, Iran. They're saying it's founded on Judeo-Christian values. That's the real argument. That's the crux of the argument of America being a Christian nation. Let's see what he argues.
This is a common phrase you hear in many Christian nationalist circles. Their argument is that while people are free to practice any religion per the First Amendment in this country, America is still a Christian nation for three key reasons. The founders and the majority of the country were and are primarily Christian. The values emphasized in things like the Declaration of Independence and Constitution come from a Christian foundation, and separation of church and state is not in the Constitution and wasn't the idea of the First Amendment, since several of the colonies had official state religions at the time the Constitution was ratified.
Never heard anyone argue the separation of church and state thing, and it isn't in the Constitution. It's something that Thomas Jefferson came out, and it's not like it's a passed law or something. It's just his idea that there should be a separation of church and state, which realistically, the United States didn't want an official religion because they didn't want there to be one religion, kind of like all the European countries had. Some would be a sect of Protestantism, others would be Catholic, and they didn't want that people of that you'd have a benefit based on your religion. They didn't want you to be treated differently because you weren't the official religion. That's why a lot of people left Europe to come over to the United States, or the colonies at that time, which ended up becoming the United States.
But all three of those arguments have flaws. As far as the founders and the majority of the country being primarily Christian, well, the founders' Christian beliefs are heavily disputed. Although they were certainly deist, at least publicly believing in a higher power.
This is actually the dumbest thing people say about U.S. history when it comes to religion. Basically, the idea come out sometime in the past that Thomas Jefferson was a deist, and him being a deist meant that he could not be a Christian, like they're mutually exclusive. You can't be a deist and a Christian. And since Thomas Jefferson was a deist and he was a founding father, the founding fathers as a group, all of them were deists, so they're not Christians. First off, that's a really dumb idea for a few reasons. Number one, there were like hundreds of people that could be considered founding fathers, at least dozens, if not hundreds. And having one or two that aren't Christian would not mean that none of them are Christian. Secondly, Thomas Jefferson himself said he was a Christian. So I think I'll take Thomas Jefferson's word rather than someone who's trying to make a political point 100+ years after his death that says he's not a Christian. So the idea that all the founding fathers are deists are wrong. We know the religions of these people. You can go back and check. It's not like it's some big secret what religion they were. They were Christians. So when you argue that they weren't Christians, you're making a dumb argument to fit your narrative. But you're saying something untrue to fit a narrative, which is the very thing he complained about earlier.
Whether or not they were Christian is a different story and depends on the founder. Thomas Jefferson literally removed text from the Bible to create his own Bible, openly rejecting the supernatural elements of Scripture.
Just because he rejected some parts of Christianity doesn't mean he wasn't a Christian at all. And I haven't looked into that, but him removing certain parts of the Bible that he didn't like, I mean, that doesn't mean he's not a Christian. Like, you don't have to accept every single tenet of a religion to be a member of that religion.
Benjamin Franklin openly questioned Jesus' divinity. Also,
that's another thing. Questioning religion doesn't mean that you don't believe in your religion. Like, these are not good arguments. And once again, this is two guys. These are the two examples he's giving. He admits that, I mean, they're basically admitting that Benjamin Franklin was a Christian that questioned Jesus' divinity. Thomas Jefferson had a Bible that he took some sections out of. That doesn't mean they were Christians. In fact, Jefferson stated he was a Christian.
So, what does it matter what they were or what the majority of the country is? America is primarily white, as were the founders. Does that make it a white nation?
There are people that would argue that it is a white nation and build on racism, but I disagree with that. But once again, there's no founding on white. It's not based that that's the thing he's looking at, just one thing. That's majority Christians, the same as being majority white. No, it's a small part of it. The big part of it is that it was founded on Judeo-Christian values. This is kind of like a straw man argument he's making. That basically, because they're Christians, they're white, so it's a white country. Basically, you're making a straw man argument here rather than attacking the real argument that people make.
And if it's about the majority, well, nearly half of all Americans, a plurality by a large margin, are Protestants. So
yes, Protestants are Christians, though. So that doesn't, saying it's a Protestant nation would mean it's still a Christian nation, although there's more Christians than just Protestants.
why stop at Christian? Why not say it's a Protestant nation? See the problem? When it comes to the value,
I see the problem with his thought process, but I don't see the problem he's trying to show everyone here.
They emphasized, most of them were built on existing philosophies not developed by Christians. Although it is true the ideas like John Locke's natural rights and consent of the governed, or Montesquieu's separation of powers, were influenced heavily by their religious beliefs.
Just because the philosophies were not created by Christians doesn't mean that they're not part of Judeo-Christian values. Those values could have adopted things from other people and made them their own. So that's not a good argument. That'd be like saying that if you went to Vegas and saw an Elvis impersonator, and you say, "Well, I saw an Elvis impersonator," the person's like, "No, he's not an Elvis impersonator. There were people singing before Elvis." Yeah, but you're still an Elvis impersonator. Just because Elvis sang like people before him doesn't mean that, and he didn't invent the idea of singing doesn't mean you can't have Elvis impersonators.
And it is true that those two inspired our system of government. Locke and Montesquieu weren't the first ones to espouse those ideas. Separation of powers is rooted in Greek and Roman philosophy before Christianity even existed, and Cicero was promoting natural rights of man as a Roman statesman. Finally,
it should be stated, though, that before Rome and Greece existed, at least the ancient Greece he's talking about, the country of Judea, which where the Jews come from, which is part of Judeo-Christian values, existed before those countries did. So there's even something before that. And once again, just because they adopted those policies doesn't mean that they don't have those policies as their own. I mean, you can adopt policies from someone else as part of your own and still be your Judeo-Christian values. You adopt those values, they become your own values.
although it is true there were several state religions when the Constitution was ratified, it was accepted that the First Amendment explicitly meant the federal government could not have an official religion. And after the 14th Amendment passed in 1868, subjecting state governments to the Bill of Rights, that argument became null and void.
Once again, that doesn't mean that the country wasn't founded on Judeo-Christian values. The 14th Amendment come about in the 1870s. The Constitution was written in the 1780s. It was like 90 years later that they adopted that amendment. So once again, so that doesn't mean it isn't part of the founding of the country.
Another argument they'll make is that a Bible is used to swear elected officials into power or when people are under oath. But
I've never heard that argument. I think this is a muddying of the waters here. But yeah, the fact that it's always a Bible that's chosen kind of goes to the fact that it is a Christian nation now.
But you don't have to use a Bible. You can actually swear yourself in on anything. They might even say, "In God we trust" is the official motto of the country, and "under God" is in the Pledge of Allegiance. Completely ignoring the fact that both of those were added in the 1950s as a propaganda tool in a deliberate attempt to differentiate the United States from the Soviet Union.
Okay, here's the thing though. So something being added later about the "In God We Trust" and the "Under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance doesn't count. But an amendment being added later to the Constitution does count. See how he's picking and choosing and viewing different facts in different ways? If you're going to use the reasoning that the 14th Amendment, which doesn't say anything about religion, just says the Bill of Rights apply to the states, as proof that it's not a Christian nation, then you have to look at things that happened in the 50s as proof that it is a Christian nation, right? You can't just say one counts and one doesn't count. He's kind of making arguments that are conflicting with each other. He's not using his reasoning to come to a conclusion. He's making a conclusion and using any reasoning he can to get to that conclusion, even if the reasoning conflicts with other reasoning he's made.
At the height of the Cold War. Before then, neither was a thing. "In God We Trust" wasn't even on currency before then. But a misunderstanding of the Cold War is common and leads to our next statement. Number 9, the US was the primary aggressor in the Cold War.
This one's true. The U.S. This one is true that it is stupid. The United States was not the primary aggressor in the Cold War. This is generally made by socialists and communists and people that just hate the United States. For some reason, there's a lot of people in this country that think it's cool to hate the United States. I'll let him continue from here.
Look, I'm never going to defend US foreign policy during the Cold War. It was imperialist, and when it didn't result.
Imperialist means you're building an empire. The United States wasn't building an empire during the Cold War. They weren't taking over other countries. So saying it's an imperialist policy is actually kind of stupid. They were doing what like Imperial Japan was in the World War II, or creating an imperial empire like the British did, taking over all these colonies.
Result in the direct overthrow of democratic governments in Iran, the Congo, and Guatemala?
First off, the government in Iran, the Ayatollahs, the guys that are in control now, had the freely elected prime minister assassinated. Well, then when they put their guy up to be prime minister. I mean, who's going to want to go against that and get assassinated themselves? Then when that guy took over, he started doing the same types of things Hitler did, canceling elections, disbanding the parliament, stuff like that. Basically, he was turning himself into a dictator. The same things that Hitler did. Um, and yes, they did get rid of him and put the Shah back in power, but Jimmy Carter came back and put the Ayatollahs back in power after the fact. So Iran would be a far lot better if it wasn't for Jimmy Carter doing something really stupid. Um, the fact of the matter is, yeah, the United States might have supported some people that wanted to overthrow governments in certain areas. They were overthrowing, not generally. A lot of these governments were pretty much um, communist governments that weren't very good. I don't think there was ever a few elections in the Congo. There might have been. It's still a really bad place to be. Um, a lot of these people do what these socialists do. They say they're moderates to get elected. Then when they get elected, they start doing all the extremist things. But the idea that the United States is oh so bad and done oh so many evil things, I'm not saying they didn't do any bad things, but Iran, he's completely wrong on. We helped people that wanted to overthrow a really bad government. Then we made the mistake of going back under Jimmy Carter and putting the bad government back in place. We can see that we were right to do it. You can see how bad Iran's been since 1979 compared to what it was from the mid 50s until 1979.
It just caused chaos in places like Cuba and Vietnam. And
Cuba had chaos there based on their own things. They had Castro take over. That's where the chaos in Cuba started. That wasn't us. That was them.
even say the motives were impure, much more about protecting US business interests than stopping the spread of communism, which was just a hollow pretext.
Do you really think we went to the Vietnam War to protect business interests? I mean, it was a poor country, and also Vietnam was fighting this civil war before the United States ever entered. Same thing with Korea. Um, there were rich countries that were making a bunch of money off of.
But all of this led to many revisionist historians in the 1960s to start claiming the US was the primary aggressor in the Cold War, including people worthy of respect like Gabriel Kalko.
Why is he worthy of respect? He's one of the main revisionists that came up with these crazy ideas. But my guess is he has a bias in favor of these left wing guys. Notice that he doesn't give this guy the same treatment that he gave PragerU.
Who said the US is fully responsible for starting the Cold War. To look at the US and the Soviet Union's actions starting in the 1950s, though, completely lacks context and ignores what Joseph Stalin was doing before he died. Don't forget how both countries moved dating back to the start of World War II. Under Stalin, the Soviets had annexed eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania as part of a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, all against the wishes of those countries. They then established satellite states in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania immediately after the war. Yes, they were the primary reason the Allies won the war against the Axis powers.
I wouldn't say the Soviets were the primary reason. I'd say the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union all shared in that victory. The Soviet Union kind of took a lot of the brunt of the attack of the Germans, but they needed stuff the U.S. gave them there. Plus, they needed the United States opening extra fronts like in Africa, Italy, and Normandy in order to win that war. To give most of the credit to the Soviet Union for winning World War II is just false. They lost a lot of soldiers, but they don't care about people at all. The United States lost a lot too. They put a lot of treasure. So to say that they're more important is I just disagree with that.
But that was only after Germany invaded them. The US, meanwhile, implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and the USSR forbade the countries in which it had satellite states from accepting any help. The Soviets also kept troops in Iran past an agreed withdrawal date and annexed part of territorial Japan after the war. After consolidating power, Stalin resulted in the Iron Curtain being formed in 1946, and it was very clear he wanted to spread his influence across the globe with his phrase socialism in one country, which had the explicitly stated goal of destroying capitalism internationally. Now, you might say the Warsaw Pact was formed in response to NATO, but the key difference is countries willingly joined NATO in 1949. Nobody willingly joined the Warsaw Pact in 1955. It's very clear which side initially was more likely to respect state autonomy.
Most stuff he's saying here is true on the Soviet Union starting the Cold War part.
You could criticize U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War and even question its motives without resorting to a defense of the Soviet Union's expansionist tendencies. Maybe escalation by Harry Truman turned out to be a mistake, but he had no way of predicting Stalin's death in 1953.
This is another thing. The idea that it was only Stalin that was the bad Soviet. No, all Soviet dictators were bad. Even Gorbachev. Gorbachev was just the least bad option they had. And he realized that the Soviet Union was crumbling and he was trying to save it, which is why he was willing to negotiate because he was trying to save what was left. That's why they started letting loose in some of the countries in Eastern Europe and negotiated. Truman was right to actually oppose communism because the Soviets were trying to take over the world, the entire world, with communism. They didn't care if it was other countries, technically, that they just controlled, like the satellites. That's what their idea was. You had to fight against it. Basically, communism was basically state-run slavery.
Even George Kennan, who was highly critical of U.S. Cold War interventions and opposed expanding NATO after the USSR fell in 1991, understood the threat the Soviets posed under Stalin, which is why he came up with the policy of containment. Number 8. Democrats supported slavery and Jim Crow, while Republicans supported abolition.
That's 100% true. The Democrat Party was the party of slavery, party of Jim Crow, the party of segregation, party of the KKK. To say they weren't is a lie. And I know people try to act like, oh, no, that's not really what it is now. But yeah, that's what it is.
On paper, this statement is true. The point many try to get across with it, though, is so misleading it'll make your head spin. It's first worth noting that this isn't entirely true, as the Democrats were deeply split on slavery in 1860 between those who wanted to expand it and those who wanted popular sovereignty.
Okay, he doesn't even know what popular sovereignty is, which is a big problem. Their popular sovereignty was letting territories vote on whether to be slave territories or free territories, which may sound fair, but the thing is that slave states didn't come up with this idea until they had already filled all the area of the United States that could be filled with slave states. Then they wanted popular sovereignty in the area that was set aside to not have slave states. So it's just a ploy to expand slavery. Now, the other side that wanted to expand slavery didn't even want popular sovereignty. They wanted it to be made that slavery could exist in all territories, where popular sovereignty led it up to the people residing in those territories. So basically, the difference was one was pro-slavery and one was super pro-slavery. There was no one was pro-slavery and one was against slavery. Popular sovereignty was not against slavery; it was for expanding it. And even after the Civil War, if you watch the movie Lincoln, which is mostly true, there was a lot of people in the Democrat Party that voted against the 13th Amendment ending slavery. They actually had to bribe the people, like in that movie. They literally had to do anything they could to cajole Democrats that had lost their seats in the House and Senate to vote in favor of the amendment to get it passed, because the average Democrat was still in favor of slavery, even after the Civil War.
And Republicans wouldn't have called themselves abolitionists during that time.
They would call themselves abolitionists just for electability purposes. If you said you were an abolitionist before 1860, you were seen as a fringe lunatic. So basically, they said they were against the expansion of slavery. There were some abolitionists in there, but realistically, if you wanted to get elected, you couldn't let people know that you wanted to abolish slavery because people were afraid that it would trigger a civil war. And even a Republican get elected that said he wasn't an abolitionist, still triggered a civil war because the South was afraid that they might lose their slaves.
But we can let that slide to get to the gist of the point, which is mostly accurate. This is in response to the modern-day Democratic Party having a much more multiracial coalition than the Republican Party.
Having a more multiracial coalition doesn't absolve the Democrat Party of the things they did in the past. It doesn't mean they're a less racist party either. It just means they do a good job of getting a multiracial coalition together. That's all.
And the narrative perpetrated that Republicans may be more hostile to minorities. You can debate the merits of that or whether or not it's fair to say, but if you do so by resorting to this fact, you lose your argument. Some even take this as far back as Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, the first Democratic president, to paint the Democrats as the party of Native American genocide.
That's 100% true. Andrew Jackson and his vice president, following office, Martin Van Buren, were the ones that did the trial judge. Now it wasn't genocide though, because genocide is the intentional murder of a group of people. It's what you would call ethnic cleansing. Basically, they forced them out. They didn't murder them. But yes, Andrew Jackson was and the Democrat Party were pretty bad at that. Although honestly, the Republican Party had bad issues with that too. but the Democratic Party was worse to the Native Americans than the Republican Party was. Although Sherman, who was a general, Sherman and Sheridan were put in charge of the army, were really awful towards Native Americans too. So both parties were kind of bad, but the Democrats were a little worse in that regard because Jackson was like the champion of moving him as far away as you possibly could, have nothing to do with him. He thought Oklahoma was just worthless territory. He thought he moved him far enough away that we would never have to deal with them because that was the edge of the country at the time.
The Democratic Party has been the scourge of the Indians. Not Columbus, not Cabral, not Cabot, but the Democratic Party, beginning with its founder, Andrew Jackson.
For starters, parties change all the time, so you should never brand a party based on something it stood for 150, 100.
Here comes the false narrative of the quote-unquote party switch. The idea is that in the 60s, the Republican Party, for some reason beyond all that makes no sense, decided to adopt the very policies the Democrat Party used to lose almost every national election. The reason why the Democrats got back in power after the Civil War was because of the Great Depression. That's it. If the economy had totally collapsed, there's no FDR, the Democrat Party is not back in power. So the idea of a ultra-racist party did not really help. They had a solid South for a while, but even that started to break apart at a certain point because you could only hold the Southerners so far. And they used a lot of basically racist tactics that scared white people to vote Democrat because they said that the Republicans would let the black people take over, steal their women, steal their jobs, and all these other crazy things. But why would the Republican Party adopt a strategy that was a chosen loser? What happened was the Democratic Party did surveys, starting with Harry Truman in 1948, and found that if they wanted to win national elections, they were going to need to win northern states. And to win those northern states, they needed black votes. So then their policies towards black Americans started to soften on the national level. That's why Lyndon Johnson, who fought against every single civil rights bill that came down the pipe, his first 20 years in Washington, started changing his mind in the late 50s, but he did water down those bills. And he even said, when people said something about him supporting civil rights acts, if it would cause the Democrats to lose the South, he said, we may have already lost the South. It was already going against him. The reason why is because people in the South were for more anti-communists, more pro-military, and more pro-law enforcement, which are values the Republican Party held that the Democrat Party really wasn't holding like they had in the past.
170 or 200 years ago. And secondly, it ignores far too many facts. Although the GOP was the original party of abolition and is the party of Lincoln, that blatantly ignores the lily-white Republican movement in the first half of the 1900s, which focused on winning back white Southerners and ignoring the needs of black voters since they weren't significant enough of a bloc. Herbert Hoover was part of this movement.
Actually, the lily-white movement happened in the 1910s, not the 1920s. It is true that Herbert Hoover did this well, but Herbert Hoover was the most popular person in the United States in the 20s for his service during World War I. The lily-white Republican movement was under Teddy Roosevelt and his protege, William Howard Taft, who people wrongly believe was not like Roosevelt. He was just like Roosevelt. That's where the lily-white movement came in. And basically what it did was it did focus on trying to win over some moderate Southern whites, not the racist Southern whites. Like, it wasn't trying to get the Klan members. Those were pretty much locked up by the Democratic Party. It was trying to get the moderate ones, which tended to live in the areas that you see here. The Upper South, Texas because of new population going in, and Florida eventually had some new population going in. So yeah, and this is part of the reason why Lyndon Johnson said that the Democrats might have already lost the Solid South, because they were. It wasn't just this election in 28. Eisenhower did just as well or better in the 1950s in the South. The Democrats were no longer had that Solid South they could just reliably depend on by having Klan members scare white people into voting for him.
And it's how he won 5 states of the old Confederacy in 1928: Tennessee, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Virginia. Although the South did remain solidly Democratic for 100 years after Lincoln, it also ignores third-party movements of Strom Thurmond in 1948, Harry Byrd in 1960, and George Wallace in 1968.
It should be noted that all three of those guys are Democrats, first off, And Harry Byrd actually did not run as a third party candidate. He won electoral votes, but he did not run as a third party candidate because some states had a way you could actually vote, where you could vote your electors rather than to a candidate to as undeclared, and then the electorate could pick someone, and they picked Harry Byrd. So he wasn't even a third party candidate, but he was a Democrat. But yeah, George Wallace was a Democrat. He remained a Democrat until the day he died. He was still a prominent Democrat in Georgia in the 1980s. Strom Thurmond did switch, but he was the only prominent Democrat that switched parties. And he was also the first Southern senator to actually have black members on his staff. So you could argue based on things he did that he probably did have a change of heart.
All of whom won Mississippi and Alabama due to a backlash against the National Democratic Party's evolving pro-civil rights platform. Then, of course, there's the election of 1964. To this day, you hear about how more Republicans than Democrats supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964,
which is 100% true.
But it was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, and later.
Well, Lyndon Johnson knew he needed to win those northern black voters to win national elections. He basically did a 180. He either believed in rights for blacks and finally came around supporting them when he was president, and he knew what he was doing was completely and totally wrong the whole way through the 40s and 50s when he was going against them, or he was the opposite, and he didn't change except to get reelected. And he said several terrible things like, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Something about uppity N-words need to have be given a little bit of something so they don't become too uppity. So he is not the poster child you want to put out there. He's also the guy that made Vietnam what it was that he was complaining about in the previous segment.
Later that year, the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, who voted against the Civil Rights Act, to be their standard bearer.
Okay, here's the thing. Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act based upon constitutionality. He believed it was unconstitutional for the federal government to tell private individuals how they had to run their businesses. Barry Goldwater was actually a member of the NAACP, one of the few white people. He voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, both of which Lyndon Johnson worked to water down. So he didn't vote against the act because he hated black people. He voted against the act because he believed it was unconstitutional for the federal government to tell people how they could not run their business.
Goldwater then lost in a landslide election, but still became the first Republican ever to win Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina.
How many states were I know for a fact that South Carolina was won by a few Republicans during Reconstruction. But Eisenhower won Louisiana. So yeah, these states went for him because they were pissed off at Lyndon Johnson because they thought he stabbed them in the back. But once again, that doesn't mean that he was racist. That's a very large jump.
I know. Now, why do you think that is? Of course, then came the Southern strategy in 1968, where Richard Nixon actively pursued disaffected white voters who were upset about the civil rights movement.
What the Republicans did as the Southern strategy wasn't them adopting or co-opting the Democrats' racist strategy that they had employed for over 100 years from the end of the Civil War to the Civil Rights era. What they did was they looked at these voters, and since these voters no longer had a reason to vote Democrat without thinking about it, because the Democrats were no longer, using those racist policies in the South to scare them into vote for them. Once these voters started looking at the two candidates, they looked at one side that agrees with them on things like gun rights, crime, like being tough on crime, being anti-communists, being pro-military. Also, one of the biggest things that drove the South to the Republican side was actually the Roe versus Wade, because most Southerners are pro-life. And it should be noted, though, that the South did not become a solid Republican South until George W. Bush in 2000 election. Democrats were still winning Southern states. I know you can cherry pick out a few elections here and there, because in 72 Nixon won every single state but Massachusetts. In 1984, Ronald Reagan won every single state but Minnesota. But if you throw out those big landslides, Democrats were still winning Southern states. Jimmy Carter won every former Confederate state and every border state except for Virginia in 1976. If the entire South had switched all the Republicans because the Republicans are the new racists that they were, so they decided to back them. How come they all voted for Jimmy Carter? How come Jimmy Carter did better in the South than he did anywhere else in the country when he lost to Reagan in 1980? How come Bill Clinton won southern states in 1992 and 1996? So this is basically just the basis of this guy's way he's taking facts, not giving you the whole story. He's basically using partial facts to misrepresent what happened and to mislead you. Kind of the stuff he argued against at the beginning of his video.
Many people who make this claim about the parties deny the Southern strategy ever happened. All you have to do...
They don't deny that there was a Southern strategy, they deny that there was a racist Southern strategy. There's a difference between having a strategy to court voters in the South and have a strategy to court voters in the South that's completely based on racism and made up things like dog whistles that don't really exist. They call everything a dog whistle now. Even if you say you're for lower taxes, they call that a dog whistle.
Do though is listen to people from the party. RNC Chairman Ken Millman acknowledged it happened in 2005 and officially apologized for it.
Okay, was that guy the RNC party chairman in 1968? Probably not. I mean, Democrats will never acknowledge that they had a bad past. Oh, and as far as former racists being in the parties, when he died in 2010, Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who was a grand cyclops in the KKK, who recruited his own chapter, was the president pro tem of the Senate. He was voted that by the Democrats in the Senate, even though he's a former Klan member, a high-ranking former Klan member. So the idea that all the racists ran to the Republicans and they become the racists, and Democrats are the anti-racist and not racist at all, is just a bunch of BS. This is one of the biggest lies they tell.
And since that strategy, Republicans have won a majority of white Southerners in every election.
It should also be noted that Republicans have won a majority of white Northerners, too. If you take out the votes of minorities, look at white versus non-white, Republicans win a majority of white voters everywhere. So that's basically using a facts in a misleading manner. Plus, the idea is just because someone's white from the South, it doesn't mean they're racist. The South has changed. It's not the same people that were there 60 or 80 or 100 years ago. Those people are long gone. And if it was all the racists became Republicans, how come only one senator switched parties? The Democrats had almost all the senators and almost all the representatives from the South up through the 60s. So why did only one switch sides? One, just one. That doesn't make sense.
It is perfectly legitimate for anybody to make the claim that they believe Republicans would be better for minorities than Democrats today, and vice versa. Policy debates and arguments are healthy and good for the country. But if your central argument is about what the party stood for 150 years ago, you've completely lost the plot.
I think it's an argument that you can make because the Democrats try to pretend like the Republicans are the real racists. And once again, your argument is based on what you think happened when you're wrong in 1968, what you think happened in the 1920s. So someone can't go back and look at stuff that was happening at that same time in the 20s to the 60s. No, that's not losing the plot. You're losing the plot.
7. The American Revolution was fought to protect slavery.
All right, guys, this might be the best deal paleo.
This is an argument that contaminated what should have been an invaluable piece of work central to studying American history, the 1619 Project, which came out in 2019 and did a deep dive into the legacy of slavery and its impact on the U.S. The New York Times published the work, which
The 1619 Project was just a bunch of false stuff that's not even in touch with reality.
was authored by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and while it had many enlightening claims, this was...
Notice that she gets also a totally different treatment, like the earlier pro-communist guy than what he gave PragerU. You can really see what side of the political spectrum he's from and where his biases are, even though he claims not to have them.
was one of them that did irreparable harm. Jones wrote in an essay about the project that, quote, one of the primary reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had...
This just proves how full of BS this lady is. This isn't even the worst thing she wrote. Britain didn't try to start recruiting slaves as soldiers until after the revolution started. Plus, she claims that slavery never existed before the year 1619, that it was created in the United States, which wasn't even a country in 1619. So that just proves the lady knows nothing of history. Any true historian would rip her from one end to the other, which proves to me that this guy is not a good historian at all. He does exactly what he claims other people are doing at the beginning.
Had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. Sorry, but this phrase is a major exaggeration of slavery's role in the war and is far too fair to Great Britain. Since this claim became public, it has become a widespread belief among many people who think they are exposing America's racist past when they make such a statement. But you don't have to make up facts to expose America's racist past. Saying the colonists fought the American Revolution to protect slavery is so absurd on its face, because although slavery was effectively freed in England and Wales with the Somerset case in 1772, 4 years before the Declaration of Independence, it was well protected throughout the rest of the British colonies, particularly in the Caribbean. The British didn't abolish slavery until 1834, over 50 years after the Revolution, and that was only after a series of slave revolts in their colonies. To imply staying with Great Britain was a threat to the institution of slavery lets the British off the hook way too much. Central to this claim is Lord Dunmore's proclamation promising freedom to enslaved people who chose to fight for the British in the American Revolution. But the colonies ended up doing the same thing, and after the war, neither side really kept their promise, including Britain, which worked with the Patriots to sell many of those soldiers back into slavery. More important, the most supportive colonies of secession from the British were the New England colonies, where slavery was significantly less common. And after the war, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island all passed laws in the 1780s to gradually abolish slavery.
He also misses another important fact. The United States had a very hard time getting these southern colonies to join the revolution. The New England states and New York were the ones that wanted a revolution. That's why they made George Washington the main general, because he was from Virginia, and they chose to have Thomas Jefferson be the main author of the Declaration of Independence because he was from Virginia, because they wanted to pull the southern states, the ones that had slaves in them, into the revolution with them because they knew they needed them to win it. Plus, I think there was a lot more Tories that came from the South, which were people that were from American colonies that supported the British. So realistically, it's 100% the opposite, if anything. So once again, the lady who wrote that book, she doesn't know anything about history. Even most far liberal historians laugh at how bad and unhistoric that account is. The entire 1619 project is a joke, and he shouldn't even be representing her as having anything positive out of that.
So although slavery is embedded in American history and can't be ignored, there's no way to support the notion that it was a primary reason for the American Revolution. Number 6, saying this isn't what the founders envisioned in response to any random policy by the government.
He's actually done this earlier when he was talking about how all the founders were deists.
Hear this one regularly from both sides of the political aisle. When something is done that they don't like, they'll always come out and say, this isn't what the founding fathers would have wanted, as if the founders were a monolith. The first question you should ask when someone says that is, which founder are they referring to?
That's our thing too. He tried to do the whole monolith thing one of them was a deist, but he really wasn't. So they all were deists. They are a monolith. None of them are Christians. So it's kind of funny. He's literally making the argument against the argument he made earlier.
56 people signed the Declaration of Independence, 55 attended the Constitutional Convention with 39 signing the Constitution, hundreds served in the First and Second Continental Congress, and many others like Patrick Henry and George Mason were crucial in revolutionary efforts. With this many people came an array of views across a wide political spectrum, including support for many things we would deem taboo today. Many founders didn't even want any sort of democratically elected government. They may have just joined the revolution because they wanted to break from the British. Every part of our system of government, specifically the Constitution, was a series of compromises. Nobody got what they fully wanted. There was not a bill or executive order or court ruling that has been passed in American history that wouldn't likely have had the support and opposition of at least one founding father each.
The thing is, though, is you can look at what the majority of them would have wanted. There may have been one, like an outlier here and there, but you can say, well, there's an outlier. It's like if you looked at statistics, and here's an example. Let's say someone said men are taller than women, and then he looks up the average height of the man in the United States, which I think is 5'9" or 5'10". Looked up the height of some lady in the WNBA that's over 6 foot tall and said, no, look, women are taller. This lady's 6'2", and the average man's only 5'9". That proves you're wrong. Women are taller than men. You can kind of look at the basic consensus without the basic, majority, and say, well, the majority wouldn't have. When someone says the founders wouldn't have, They don't mean every last single one of them, which is the argument he's making. This is basically another straw man argument. But if you say the founders wouldn't have liked this, you absolutely mean every single founder. So all you have to do is find one little exception, and you're wrong. No, they mean the majority or the vast majority. So even though the argument does go against his other arguments, that just proves that this isn't even a good one to even put in here, in my opinion.
To speak about such a large group of people who had wildly different views with such unanimity based on what they all would have supported 250 years later is insane. Number 5. Hate speech is not free speech.
Yeah, hate speech is protected by free speech. You wouldn't need the freedom of speech to protect things that everybody agrees with. It's to protect things that you don't like that people say.
A blatant misunderstanding of the First Amendment in general is a problem in this country. Here we have a phrase, unfortunately, uttered by high-ranking government officials all the time.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
The short response, yes, there is. In fact, the First Amendment is designed specifically to protect hate speech above all else.
It should also be stated that a lot of stuff that's been called misinformation over the last 6 years ended up actually being true, and the misinformation was the people calling it misinformation. So you got to look at that too. You got to take that into account. Sometimes the person claiming misinformation doesn't know what he's talking about.
Consider for a second if the Supreme Court allowed an exception to hate speech. Who would then determine what is hate speech? The government? Is that really what you want? Any president could just deem criticism of him or his party hate speech.
The thing is that that's the thing you need to look at. What's hate speech today might not be hate speech tomorrow. That pendulum can swing. You don't want, and there's a lot of stuff that can be labeled as hate speech because I've seen stuff where some people could say really terrible racist things about one group that they couldn't say about another group because of societal pressures. But technically speaking, if you're saying a negative thing about a group based on their race or their religion or their sex, that is technically hate speech. Even if you're disparaging the majority, it's still hate speech against them. Just because they're a majority doesn't mean that it's okay to say negative things about them.
And maybe Congress would go along with it. You don't have to like speech. You can't even find it repulsive. But if free speech doesn't protect speech that some may find repulsive, there's no point for free speech to exist. You're allowed to use racial slurs, and you're allowed to burn the American flag as a form of protest. Now, how people and private entities respond to that is their right.
And it should also be stated that if you have terrible ideas, they will lose in the marketplace of ideas if there's free speech. If there's not free speech, like in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, there is no marketplace of ideas because the government decides what you can say.
But the government has no right to stop anybody from doing those things. Number 4, the U.S. is not a democracy. It's a republic.
All right. When people say this, when they say the republic is a form of government in which you have representatives that vote for you. You may vote for those representatives. You might not vote for those representatives, but they still get together and vote for you. In the United States, you do vote for them, but you don't necessarily. But the thing is, if you're not able to vote, they still represent you. I mean, your representative, when you're 16, is still your representative. A democracy is a form of government where every single issue is voted on by the people. There is no Congress or Senate or president or anything like that. The people vote on all the issues. So if people say the U.S. is not a democracy, it's a republic, they're talking about it as a form of government, not that you vote for people. Voting people into office is not making a democracy. It's a representative republic. And people.
If you follow American politics long enough, you'll run into somebody who says this. What's funny is whenever they say it, they genuinely think they're introducing you to federalism and the separation of powers. In truth, they're proving they have no idea what those terms mean.
He has no idea what those terms mean. If he doesn't know when people say it's not a democracy, to mean a democracy is a form of government in which if taxes were going to be raised, they'd have every single person in the United States go to an election that wants to and then vote if you raise taxes or lower them or any other thing. It'd be the people voting, not Congress. There'd be no Congress. A republic has representatives that represent you in government. Democracy, there isn't representatives. You do all the voting on everything.
Democracy and republic aren't at odds with each other. A democracy is simply defined as a government where the people are the ultimate authority.
Actually, that's not the definition of a democracy as a form of government. The the democracy as a form of government is a government which you vote on everything. He doesn't know what he's talking about here.
Merriam-Webster literally says it's a government by the people. A republic is a form of government in which leaders and representatives elected by the people govern according to law.
Actually, the leaders don't have to be elected by the people. I think, like, some of these countries like the Soviet Union would have representatives or something that weren't elected. They were just selected by government officials. In fact, I think the House of Lords in Britain, none of those people are elected. They're all appointed, or they're all either appointed or the House of Commons is elected. House of Lords is either appointed or they're hereditary positions, like they're nobles and earls and duchesses and stuff like that. But they still represent the people. They just don't get to vote on them.
The U.S. is a representative democracy and a constitutional federal republic, where power ultimately lies with the people who elect their representatives, and those representatives govern within the constraints of the Constitution.
Do you know how amazing it is?
In the constraints of the Constitution. When people say the U.S. isn't a democracy, what they really mean is that the federal government is not a direct democracy, where voters just vote on the policies they want, similar to state ballot initiatives.
Exactly. You're making a straw man argument, acting like they're saying something or not, but now you're admitting to it, that it's not a direct democracy. When they say it's a republic, it's not a democracy, that's what they mean. So you're basically not even arguing against what they're saying. You're making up some false argument to say, well, republics are democracies too, because the leaders are democratically elected, which no. There's two different forms of government.
They also mean that the federal government is not dictated by a simple majority. But neither of those things is a prerequisite for any type of democracy, broadly speaking.
No, they are a that's what a democracy is. It's a government in which the people vote on things. They don't have representatives. As a form of government, that's what a democracy is.
To say it's a republic, not a democracy, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what those words mean.
You have the fundamental misunderstanding of what those words mean because you don't even know that what a republic or a democracy is. You think that they're the same thing when they're not.
The Irish were treated worse than any ethnic group in the U.S. In response to the racial tension that has permeated throughout social media in recent years, this became a recurring claim shared across multiple platforms and even made its way into some publications like Irish Central, Irish Examiner, and Scientific American. This argument comes in many forms, but its central claim is that the Irish were slaves just like people from Africa and in many ways were treated worse in the United States.
There are truths to those claims. They were slaves too. I know they are called indentured servants, but many of them were forced against their will.
It wasn't true. In fact, this myth was widely debunked by several Irish scholars in a 2016 Medium post asking publications to stop mentioning it.
Because an Irish scholar said it's not true doesn't mean it's not true. I bet you could find scholars that would say it is true. So, once again, you take only the proof that backs your argument.
This narrative comes from a misrepresentation of indentured servitude, which is how many poor Europeans migrated to North America and the Caribbean in the early colonial period. In this setup, a migrant would give 4 to 7 years of free labor in exchange for food, property, and their own freedom in the Americas once that period was completed. Now,
that's the textbook definition of indentured servitude, and there were people that came over that way, but there were a lot of people that were forced to come over against their will, which makes them a slave. There's also a lot of them that served much longer than 4 to 7 years. There were some that served for their lives. So the idea that all quote-unquote indentured servants were treated as he says is just false. Like, he needs to do his homework and dig into things a little deeper.
It is true that indentured servitude could often be more harsh than slavery because indentured servants would eventually be free, so they weren't as valuable of a commodity. But they still had the opportunity to be free.
Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Slaves sometimes had the opportunity to be free. There were slaves that worked extra and bought their way out of slavery. So it was a rare opportunity, but it was an opportunity. But slavery is still slavery. Diminishing the slavery of one person versus another is kind of wrong. They were generally treated the same, and they generally were not there based on what they wanted. They were generally forced over. It was forced labor, no matter how you look at it.
More importantly, they actively chose indentured servitude en route to that freedom.
Some did, some didn't. That's the thing. He's acting like there were none that didn't. I don't know if he just doesn't know this because he doesn't do his research, or if he's just trying to prove a point by leaving out important facts.
Slaves from Africa didn't opt into slavery, and they had no option to be free. What's worse is that when making this claim, photos of Irish laborers during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era are shown, in which
What does it matter if they show the wrong photos? I've seen them talk about slaves before and show pictures that were taken after the 1865. I mean, them taking having an inaccurate picture with it doesn't change the facts.
which slavery was clearly already outlawed in the US. Again, these were families of immigrants from Ireland who willingly came to America and took those jobs. It wasn't forced on them.
It was forced on some of them. Learn your facts, sir.
That era coincides with a time period of virulent racism among different European ethnicities in the United States, to be fair. Madison Grant most notably published The Passing of the Great Race in the early 20th century, where he argued the Irish were inferior to other Western Europeans, which helped fuel this narrative. That's wrong. It's tragic, and the working conditions of many Irish immigrants are to be condemned. It is still nothing compared to the 240 years of chattel slavery that African people were subjected to and the 100 years of Jim Crow laws that followed. The narrative of Irish slavery is a political tool to dismiss the suffering of African Americans in this country, and is thoroughly disproven. But it's part
It's actually been proven to be true. You just ignore that proof.
of a broader problem that leads to our next dumb statement.
Martin Luther said, I want to make...
Just generally diminishing the impact of slavery. This covers multiple wrong things said about slavery. One is the idea that it was commonplace with nobody ever questioning its morality until the 19th century.
Actually, slavery was commonplace. Slavery existed everywhere in the world. The first countries to ban slavery were Western European countries and the United States. In fact, I think that certain states in the United States, like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, banned slavery before any country banned slavery. So yeah, it was commonplace. There was slavery all through history. To pretend like it didn't exist is just absolutely creating false facts.
Another is to minimize its race-based impact in the United States.
The fact is it happened over 160 years ago. The last people were slaves. I think people overemphasize the impact of slavery today.
One of the most common defenses is that nobody considered it morally wrong when America was founded.
Everybody who could afford one had a slave.
But just
And that's a liberal in Bill Maher who said that. And yeah, people did consider it morally wrong, but they didn't know how to get rid of it. That's why it took a while to get rid of slavery in the United States. They were questioning slavery before anywhere else was. They just couldn't. And they tried to get rid of it, but in order to get South Carolina and Georgia to join the United States, they couldn't just get rid of it. That's why it wasn't gotten rid of earlier. But yes, it wasn't normal. Slavery was the norm through history. There's still slavery that exists today in parts of the world in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa.
a reading of James Madison's Federalist Papers and statements by several of the founding fathers made it very clear they knew slavery was immoral.
And here he goes. Here he goes. He's saying the founding fathers knew, like they all knew. Not every founding father was against slavery. The argument he made earlier that you can't judge it all by one, he's not making. Once again, they wanted to end slavery. They didn't know how to because it was the normal. It was the normal thing to happen all over the world. Even in the Americas, before the Europeans got here, the Native Americans had slaves.
Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and several other notable founding fathers all commented on the evils of slavery even while they owned slaves, and we know that several compromises were made on the issue just so the Constitution could be ratified with the hope that slavery would eventually die a natural death.
Exactly. They were trying to get rid of it. So the idea that America is somehow evil over it, more evil than every other country in the world, is kind of ridiculous, especially when it was the United States, France, and Great Britain that led the world into ending slavery. They're the three countries that generally get the most crap over it.
At the time of the convention, 5 states had already passed laws that would facilitate gradual abolition of the practice. So
before any other country did. That's the thing. That happened before any other country did. So the United States was better on the issue than everyone else. But yes, it was the norm everywhere before this.
the idea that it wasn't considered wrong is just factually not true.
No one's saying that it wasn't wrong. That's the thing. This is another strawman argument. When someone says it was the norm, they're not saying that slavery wasn't wrong. They're saying that was the norm that went on at that time. But he's got to twist what someone's words is so he can make an argument against it, because he can't argue against the fact they're saying that slavery was the norm. He's got a lot of strawman arguments in this entire thing.
Then there's the argument that the institution is as old as civilization itself.
It is. That's a truth. That's true. You can't. He doesn't know facts if he doesn't believe that.
Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day.
What's so wrong about this statement is the fact that while slavery may be as old as civilization itself, it has come in many forms. And the form of chattel slavery practiced in the transatlantic slave trade was a uniquely cruel form of slavery.
You want to talk about first? We want to talk about a uniquely cruel form of slavery. I would say it was the slavery that was practiced by the Barbary pirates in northern Africa. If you were captured and made a galley slave, they chained you into the galley. You never got up. You didn't have enough room to lay down. So you basically had to eat whatever food they gave you, which I'm sure wasn't that good, and pee and poop yourself and row the galley. That was your entire life in a galley. They would take young girls and sell them as what they called concubines, which are basically prostitutes. When I say young, I mean like 10 to 12-year-old girls as basically sex slaves. Yes, I'm not saying chattel slavery wasn't bad, but there was definitely far worse forms of slavery than that. And even slaves that came to the United States had it worse because generally slavers in the United States had better survival rates than they did in other parts of the Americas. Or the ones that went to the East were treated far worse when all the men were castrated. And they actually had higher death rates going east in Africa than they did going across the Atlantic Ocean. So no one's saying slavery was good. Everyone knows what's a bad thing, but you got to look at historical context. It was the norm at the time. And the idea that it's the slavery of Africans who came to America is the only bad slavery ever is a ridiculous argument that he seems to be making. He totally dismisses the Irish slaves, and he doesn't talk about slavery that was worse.
Kidnapping people from other places, stuffing them in ships below deck, and transporting them across the ocean was not a universal practice throughout world history.
First and foremost, white people didn't go to Africa and kidnap slaves. That's absolutely false. They went to Africa and they were sold slaves. One of the biggest countries, a country called Dahomey, which you can look up, that basically lived on the slave trade. They would capture the tribes and sell them as slaves. And the slaves that they couldn't sell, they would ritually sacrifice and kill. So, as bad as it was to be sold as a slave, the alternative was actually worse. Or if they were sent to the east rather than across the transatlantic, it was even worse. The fact of kidnapping people and putting them in boats is what once again, the Barbary pirates did that. They would raid villages on the Mediterranean Ocean. That's why there wasn't a lot of cities there, and capture people, or they'd capture people off one ship and make them slaves. So it actually was happening. And the thing was, yeah, slaves were being shipped across the Atlantic before then because nobody was shipping anything across the Atlantic before then. They didn't realize that they could get somewhere. But they were capturing slaves and transporting them. They were just transporting them in a different way.
So yeah, even by slavery standards, America is guilty of one of the worst forms.
I would argue that it's probably, especially if you look at the time, one of the least bad forms. Far worse to be a galley slave. Far worse if you were sent into the East African slave trade. Far worse to be turned into a concubine. That's what I'm saying. Slavery is bad, but I would say that even if the ones who went to other countries were far worse, because generally speaking, they would usually die of disease. People that came to the Americas, at least as bad as slavery was, they were probably treated better than the ones that went into the down to Brazil or down to Cuba.
But what's even more ridiculous is how commonplace it is to now diminish the racial impact of slavery, which includes the argument that there were some black slave owners, other Africans were the ones who sold people to the Europeans into slavery, and that very few white people actually owned slaves.
Even though all three of those are true facts, there were black slave owners. The people who captured the slaves were black. There wasn't white people going in capturing them. And something like 2% of people owned slaves in the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War.
Only less than 2% of white Americans own slaves.
None of these diminish the point that slavery was by and large race-based in this country.
And to a point, I mean, once they got rid of indentured servitude, as it's called, then it was race-based. But yes, it was wrong that it was race-based, but slavery's wrong regardless of that. That's just a factor in this case that it was race-based. I mean, does it make it okay if the slave's the same race as you? That's kind of a dumb argument, ain't it?
And there's no way around it. To address each of them, the peak number of black slave owners mentioned was just over 3,700, which comes from the 1924 Research Department of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History.
How many free blacks were there when there's 3,700 black slave owners now? That would matter.
And cites the 1830 census. That's barely a tenth of 1%.
Once again, though, most blacks that lived in the United States were slaves. If you remove them from the equation, that number probably goes up to close to what it was for white slave owners, I bet, at that time.
Meanwhile, in the South, 1 in 4 white families owned slaves, so while it may have been 2% nationally, it was 25% versus 1/10 of 1% in the places where white and black people lived.
Actually, these numbers, notice how he's saying it's total blacks that own slaves? But he's saying white families. So, like, if dad owned a slave, he's counting it being owned by everyone in the family, where if a black father owned a slave, it was just him. The other people aren't counting in that number. See how he's kind of using two different standards here? Plus, he's not counting the people that are actually slaves. So I bet you that 0.1% would go up a whole lot when you consider that. Probably something like 95 to 99% of black people were slaves. Because as I said, it was race-based, so most blacks were slaves, so there weren't very many free blacks to even own slaves. Once again, what's the numbers matter? What the percentage matters? 2% of white people, 0.1% of black people, including slaves that couldn't own other slaves that had slaves. Still, it's bad. No one's saying it's right, but people act like everybody owned slaves back then, which they really didn't.
More importantly, 0% of white people were enslaved.
This is actually false here. As we stated, that there were actually people forced into slavery that weren't white. It's just that he's not accounting for those people.
And on the eve of the Civil War, 89% of black people, or 3.9 to 4.4 million, were enslaved.
So there you go. 90% of black people were enslaved. So that 0.1% probably goes up a whole lot more when you take that 90% out. That's probably if you figure you're taking 90%, you're probably getting close to 1%, which isn't too far below the less than 2% of white people that own slaves.
Even count the number of white-owned businesses and institutions and communities that directly profited from slavery, even if those white people didn't own slaves. Manufacturing business...
Guilty by association, I guess. I mean, right? But the thing is businesses all over the world profited this way because slavery was the norm. Once again, he tries to deny it, but it's true.
Businesses in northern cities like New York and Boston, all white-owned, profited immensely from slavery. So it's grossly misleading and frankly stupid to dismiss the racial impact of slavery by saying that less than 2% of white people own slaves.
It's true that less than 2% of white people own slaves, though, but you dismiss it when you say less than only 0.1% of black people own slaves. When you take out the 90%, it's like 1% of black people who were free own slaves too. But that you dismiss too. So once again, his statistics don't match up well.
Far more profited from it in some way, and from the reverse, the vast majority of black people were slaves, while no white people were slaves. If you don't believe slavery was race-based, then you just didn't read what pro-slavery forces were saying in the 19th century.
Nobody's saying that slavery was not race-based. That's not even... I've never heard anyone say slavery in America was not race-based. So literally he's making an argument against something that's not even said by anybody on earth. Once again, not a very good argument, not a very valid argument. But people acting like their entire life is controlled by something that happened to their ancestors 160 years ago and they're hopeless victims goes overboard.
One quick look at Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney's majority opinion in the 1857 Dred Scott decision will tell you everything you need to know about just how race-based slavery was.
It should be noted that the non-racist Andrew Jackson that he defended earlier, who put Robert Taney on the Supreme Court, and another Democrat was the one that got the wide decision there that named James Buchanan. You know, those guys that weren't racist at all and were against slavery according to him.
So stop pretending it wasn't. But inability to read primary sources is very common in America, and it's what leads to our final inaccurate statement.
Once again, people can read primary sources. He obviously can't because he doesn't know that there were actually quote-unquote indentured servants that were forced into it, so they were slaves. And I've never heard a single person say that slavery was not race-based, although there were white slaves too. But yeah, the slavery in the South that was not indentured servants was race based. No one's arguing that slavery wasn't bad or immoral. The argument is that it was the norm at the time of the world up until when it was started getting abolished in the mid 1800s. And it was led by those evil white countries are the ones that abolished slavery. In fact, it was when the countries like France and Britain took over Africa that slavery was abolished in Africa finally. Although you got some parts of Africa that are part of the Muslim world that still have forms of slavery.
And the number one dumbest thing people say about U.S. history when trying to sound smart? The Civil War wasn't about slavery.
When people basically the Civil War was about slavery, but it wasn't only about slavery. Basically, when the Democratic Party was formed, it was formed as a pro-slavery, anti-Indian party, and the pro-slavery part got them the vast majority of Southern votes, so they won all those Southern states. And the anti-Indian got them the Western states, which was pretty much the areas west of the Appalachian Mountains. So you kind of had New York and Pennsylvania that were on both sides of the Appalachian Mountains. And in the north that were swing states, and everything west of that was western states that they were able to get. And everything south of Pennsylvania and the Ohio River was the South. So they basically successfully built a party that was pro-slavery and anti-Indian. Now, Andrew Jackson was very successful in moving the Indians out far to the west. You got to remember at the time they were far west of the Mississippi, and this was before the Mexican-American War, so no one foresaw, having settlements much west of the Mississippi. So what was the West ceased being the West, and that part became more closely associated with the Northeast, especially the New England states. So what the South had then was a situation where they wanted to make sure that the Senate was 50% slave states, 50% free states. Well, if the South was not allowed to expand further west with slavery, then eventually the North would completely take over the Senate. So the South, who had actually held sway of federal power up until Lincoln was elected, because they could use the power of the South plus the Northern Democrats, which basically worked with the Southern Democrats to form a majority. But they were getting to the point where the North and South were that the Republicans were taking enough power in the North that they could beat the Democrats by enough that even the South couldn't make up for that. The Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in the 1858 election, and Lincoln won the 1860 election. And even if all the other candidates had run together and won all the votes they did, Lincoln still would have won the election based on the proportionment of electoral votes. So the South saw its power slipping, and they needed to expand new slave states in the West to hold at least, equal power in the Senate. They knew that wasn't going to happen with Lincoln becoming president because the Republicans were opposed to adding new slave states. So the Republicans weren't going to take the slaves from the southern states. They just weren't going to let them make more slave states. So they didn't have to worry about losing their slaves. They just had to worry about losing power within the federal government, which is why they became ever increasing about states' rights. Because if you don't have much power on the federal level, you want to have power. You want more power being exercised on the state level than the federal level. If you're a minority in the federal government, you want a weak federal government and strong state governments. Plus, the average person fighting in the Civil War, even as you said, 25% of families in the South owned slaves. Notice he didn't only in the South with the statistics. But if you look at that, then that means that the vast majority of families in the South did not own slaves. So why would those guys fight? Well, they fought because they saw the North as invading the South. So even if you disagree with the assessment that the North invaded the South, that's how they saw it.
Fake Southern intellectuals will really think they blew a Northerner's mind when they say this. They'll look you dead in the eye and say the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights.
In a way, it was partially about. It was about both in a way. It was about slavery, because slavery was the big deciding factor of why the South wanted certain things, and the North wanted certain things. The South didn't want free land in the West because their two biggest things were their slaves and the acreage of land they had. So if you devalue the land, that cuts into their wealth. They also didn't want tariffs because most of the imported goods were actually sold in the South. The North bought more goods that they created in their factories up north. Plus, those tariffs helped the northern factories, and they didn't really help the southern plantations. So, once again, because the South was slavery, was a slavery issue, slavery area, lower tariffs benefited them. They also didn't want the government spending money on what was called internal improvements. A lot of people call them pork bills today. Pork barrel bills, basically building roads, canals, bridges, and the such, usually infrastructure projects, because that money needed to come from somewhere. If that money came from tariffs, they didn't like it. Plus, they wanted land sold in the West as another way of lowering tariffs. So slavery did cause the differences, but it wasn't the only difference. And once again, they wanted that political power. They wanted to hold sway over the federal government if they couldn't. They wanted the state governments to be the power base, not the federal government.
First off, states' rights to what? That theory is dismantled right on its face. But
like I said, they wanted to have more power in the states because they were losing grip on the federal level.
the fact of the matter is, this is just wrong in every way. And all you have to do is read every state's Declaration of Secession when the Confederacy was formed to figure it out. Let's just quote the first reason given for secession by some of those declarations.
Yeah, that's going to say that they left because of slavery. Which institution of slavery was important. It was part of their, basically, part of the fabric of the South. And the North was becoming ever increasingly hostile towards slavery. So, yeah, that was one of the big differences between the two. But the South felt that the North was butting in where they didn't belong. And the North felt that the South, that it was morally wrong. And that's where the rub came. And that rub was coming even if you look at the Missouri Compromise, it started like 1820. It got ever increasingly worse over time.
South Carolina. An increasing hostility on the part of non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery. Mississippi. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia. We have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery.
Okay, now these are states among the first 7 states that left. What about the 4 states that left only after Lincoln called for volunteers after Fort Sumter? Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. Everyone that makes these quotes and points to these specific states never point to those states that only left after Lincoln wanted to create an army to suppress the rebellion in the other states. So even if you believe that these 7 states only left because of slavery, certainly the states that left after Lincoln called for more federal power and called for troops left for other reasons. And certainly people who didn't own slaves really didn't leave to protect the slaves of other people in the states. That doesn't even make sense. So there were lots of different reasons why people left, kind of like this whole the founders aren't a monolith. Neither is every single person that lived in the South in the 1860s. There are different reasons. So yeah, the problem is that people have no nuance discussing this. Now, I'm not saying the South was right. I'm definitely against slavery. I feel it's morally wrong. When I'm discussing history in the lens of the time and not trying to put my modern day morals onto people that existed 160 years ago.
Guys, I think this war was about slavery. Just to address some of the arguments made to the opposite cause, many cite Jefferson Davis's inaugural address where he highlighted states' rights and never mentioned slavery.
Well, if it was only about slavery and the entirety of the Confederacy was only about slavery, you think he would have at least said something about it. And if it had nothing at all to do with states' rights, why would he mention it? Like I'm saying, I'm not saying it wasn't about slavery, it was, but it's also about other things. It's about power and it's about money.
But that address was about the new Confederate States of America and the states' rights within that union, not specifically why each individual state seceded. And
yeah, but you can't tell me that wasn't on their mind why they seceded when he was starting a new government.
The eventual Confederate Vice President, Alexander H. Stephens, explicitly said slavery was the cornerstone of the new government. You will also commonly hear the phrase, Abraham Lincoln didn't initially want to free the slaves.
He probably personally wanted to free the slaves, but he even stated himself If he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would do so. And the fact of the matter was, when Lincoln started the war, it wasn't to free the slaves, it was to preserve the Union. So the idea that he only fought for that North's only fighting to free the slaves is actually wrong as well.
While he explicitly stated he wasn't going to abolish slavery, he was going to ban slavery in new territories, or at least fight to do so.
Well, yeah, that was the rub. The rub wasn't that the people in the South were going to lose their slaves. The rub was that they couldn't get new states out west, which would mean that their position in the government would be ever decreasing. They'd become a smaller and smaller minority, which is why they left. That's power. That's the federal level of power.
And that alone wasn't enough for the Southern states to secede. So in reality, the statement about Lincoln makes the Southerners look even more gung-ho pro-slavery. They were trying to expand it to make sure it survived.
They were trying to expand it to make sure that their power survived. I'm sure if it would have been, because there was even offers that if an amendment was passed that would have protected slavery, they still said no, that wouldn't be enough, because they wanted to make sure they had their level of what they felt was their appropriate level of power in the federal government, not just to keep their slaves.
Which again, makes the war about slavery. And of course, there's the argument of the border states, the slave states that sided with the Union.
I mean, if it was just an argument, if it was a war, as he's trying to say that the North was trying to abolish slavery and the South was trying to keep it, border states themselves would have all sided with the Confederacy. They all would have went over too. Maybe not Delaware because they didn't have a lot of slaves. New Jersey also had slaves at the time, but not very many. But there would certainly been no reason for Kentucky and Missouri not to secede. And you could make the argument that Maryland did because Lincoln declared martial law. But yeah, if it was all about slavery, nothing but slavery, then all the slave states would have left and all the non-slave states would have stayed.
But just because slavery was the central reason for secession doesn't mean every slave state felt secession was worth it. And Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware weren't monolithic.
Neither was every other Confederate state. Like, okay, every state that left was a monolithic state, but the states that stayed were not monolithic.
There was plenty of Confederate support in those states, just as there was Union support in Confederate areas like East Tennessee and Western Virginia, the latter of which broke off and became West Virginia. And want to know a secret? The Union support in Confederate states was in areas where slavery was less economical, like the Appalachian Mountains.
So money and power then? Because, right?
And the Confederate support in border states was where slavery was more common. Gee, imagine that. Finally.
But still, those states would have seceded. They were still slave states at the heart of it. I mean, Delaware, you can make the argument because they had very few slaves by that time. But the other ones had enough slaves. In fact, Missouri had enough border ruffians across to vote in Kansas elections to get a pro-slavery constitution approved.
Even the states' rights argument makes no sense. If the Confederacy truly cared about states' rights, why was one of their grievances listed for secession about northern states not sufficiently doing their part to uphold federal law with the Fugitive Slave Act?
Just because a person believes in states' rights, it doesn't mean that they believe there should be absolutely no federal government. This would be like making the argument if someone was for states' rights and then someone stole their car and drove across state lines, that they think their car should be returned to them. I mean, and not to be callous or mean, but slaves were viewed as property at the time. They weren't viewed as people.
Why did representatives from those states push for tougher enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850?
Because it's about money. Them slaves were worth a lot of money, so they wanted them back. Once again, that's why. Money, power, number two, the big things that you're missing here.
That is blatantly a violation of states' rights. It requires...
It's not a... First off, it was a federally passed law. It's funny, though, that they think that's a violation of states' rights, but other laws... You could also argue that the Emancipation Proclamation was a violation of states' rights, too, right? That was made without even passing a law.
Free states that outlawed slavery to still recognize slaves as property when they and their owners were visiting those territories, and it required individuals and governments in free states to return escaped slaves whenever given the opportunity.
It didn't require individuals. The actual fugitive slave law that was passed in 1850 used federal marshals to do so.
That doesn't sound like states' rights. In truth, the slave states had spent years trying to force their way of life on everybody else. And
Exactly. They spent years trying to force their way of life on everybody else, meaning they had the power.
When northern states finally revolted with the election of Lincoln, the southern states all wanted to take their ball and go home.
Exactly. When they lost their grip on power, they wanted to leave. That's the crux. That's what I've been arguing. He has it kind of there, but he can't get past it. It's all about slaves because he made his mind up, and his reasoning doesn't fit with his final analysis. Basically, he makes his decision, then he tries to make his reasoning fit it.
Then, after losing a war that was for an unjust cause, they created the lost cause narrative as part of their reconciliation process, referring to it as the War of Northern Aggression.
Well, both sides created stories that made their side look better. Plus, once again, even though slavery was a major issue, not every single Southerner fought for slavery. Not every single Northerner fought to free the slaves. Most Northerners were fighting to preserve the Union, and most Southern soldiers were actually fighting because they saw the Northerners as invading their South, which was their home. You can argue that they were wrong or not, but that was what they were fighting for. And they actually, there's plenty of writings from these people at the time that you can see that that's why they were fighting. This isn't some mystery where we don't have proof.
When you consider the fact that Robert E. Lee and his army launched 2 invasions into Union states that culminated with the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg,
Two battles. Lee had 2 battles in the northern states, one of which was kind of half in the south state of Maryland. The other was in Pennsylvania. How many battles did he fight in Virginia? I don't even know. Most of the war took place in the South. There were a few. There were some battles in states like Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. But even as he stated, those states were like half in, half out of the Confederacy anyway. The only battle that took place in a non-slave state was the Battle of Gettysburg. The rest of it took place either in the South or the border states.
in Maryland and Pennsylvania respectively, and the fact that the Confederates fired the first shot in the war at Fort Sumter.
Yeah, they did fire the first shot. See, there's kind of a argument there. But many states that left, like Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas, left because Lincoln was getting ready to build an army to go down and subdue the South. That's why they left.
Even the concept of calling it the War of Northern Aggression is a blatant lie. The Civil War was about slavery, and there's no justification for the Confederacy in the eyes of anybody with a surface level knowledge of history.
I'd say this guy lacks. I mean, if you have an actual knowledge of history and you know what nuance is, you know there's going to be more than one cause for something. You know that it was, yes, it was about slavery, but it wasn't only about slavery. So I'd say he's kind of got a good portion of the wrong of the argument here. Pretty much going to cut it off here. There's not much left in this video, like 30 seconds. I want to thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and have a great day. For watching, like, share, subscribe, comment, and have a great day.